Good day. Yesterday, in my previous video, I said that I would today comment or discuss the Russian missile attacks on Ukraine. But before I do that, I suppose I have to comment on the incident of the missile that fell on Polish territory and killed 2 people there. A tragedy for them, a sad tragedy for them. The missile seems to have fallen on a farm, an empty farm, but these 2 people were there. I've seen some reports that they were involved in some kind of a tractor, in agricultural activity, and anyway, they were killed by the fall of this missile. Now, at the time when we first got reports about this missile, the reports all suggested that it was a Russian missile, part of the Russian missile offensive that was unleashed on Ukraine by the Russians yesterday. As information began to trickle out, some skepticism was expressed. It wasn't at all obvious why the Russians would launch a missile strike on Poland at precisely this time. But also I should say that there was suggestions that more than one missile was involved, that there were in fact 2. And entirely predictably, the British media, ahead of practically the media in every other place, rushed out articles about a Russian missile strikes on Ukraine. And if you travel to a newsagent here in Britain and you see the printed editions of the British newspapers, you see all the headlines about Russian missile strikes on Ukraine, and some of them in extremely vivid terms, and they talk about Russian aggression and about Russian threats to Poland, and well, one might get the impression that something very serious had happened. To my mind, what that shows is the extent to which the British media almost is completely geared up to expecting missile strikes from Russia against Poland, against NATO countries, and that it really isn't interested at all in alternative hypotheses. And I'm going to come to a peculiar twist in that shortly. But anyway, as time passed, pictures of debris from this missile appeared. And first of all, I think it's now fairly established that it was only one. And secondly, it was very quickly identified. And this was now the universal consensus from all sides, from the Russians, the Poles, the Western powers, that the missile in question is one of the S-300 air defense surface-to-air missile family. In other words, it's a missile that would be used in order to shoot down missiles and aircraft. And that already tends to make it more likely that it was a Ukrainian missile. And in fact, as studies of the pictures became clearer, it was established that this was one of the older versions of the S-300. I should explain that the S-300 is not a single missile. It is a very, very large and extremely complex missile family, many of which, by the way, use quite different launchers, as well as being quite different from each other. But it's a very large, very wide spread missile family, which must have begun development by the Soviet Union, I'm going to guess, sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s. It was very sophisticated when it first appeared around the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 1980s. And development of this missile family has continued ever since. There are other versions, new versions of this family, which continue to be produced in Russia and continue to operate within the Russian armed forces. The S-400 missile system, about which we hear so much, which is perhaps the most advanced surface-to-air missile system in the world, is not exactly a replacement for the S-300 system or family of systems. It is in effect an outgrowth of it. It is yet another evolution of this very complex family of missiles. And this one, the one that fell in Poland, has been identified as one of the very earliest versions, one that the Soviet Union was producing from roughly 1979 to 1982. So this is an older version of the S-300 family, and almost certainly a system that is neither produced in Russia anymore, in fact I think we can take that as a certainty, or which is any longer fielded by the Russian armed forces. So that already points to this most probably being a Ukrainian system. And those who understand these things better than me have also pointed out that the range of this particular system, this particular missile, is around 75 kilometers. And given the location in Poland where this missile fell, it's most unlikely that it could have been launched from Belarus. In fact, it's almost inconceivable. Belarus does also field S-300 missiles, and it is impossible that it could have been launched from Russia. The missile, this particular missile, doesn't have that kind of range, that it could have been launched either from Russia or from Russian-controlled territory. So the inescapable conclusion to which every objective person has come to, including, it appears, the Pentagon, is that this was a Ukrainian air defense missile, a missile launched by Ukraine in a presumably failed attempt to intercept Russian cruise missiles, which were bombarding Ukraine in large numbers yesterday. This particular missile was launched. This Ukrainian S-300 missile was launched. It apparently failed to hit the target. The Poles, who are now examining this missile, say that the warhead itself failed to explode. And instead, as has happened quite often over the course of this conflict, having failed to hit its target, this missile then fell to earth, and unfortunately it fell on Poland, and it killed 2 men. Now, I should say that this has happened several times, many times in fact. There have been instances of Ukraine launching S-300 missiles, those missiles failing to find a target, and then crashing back to earth, sometimes causing damage to civilian buildings, which are then quite often falsely attributed to Russian missile strikes. So this is what has happened this time. It was clearly an error. There's no conceivable reason, in fact, one can absolutely exclude the possibility that the Ukrainians were seeking to attack Poland. That would make absolutely no sense at all, and no one is suggesting it. And in fact, this particular missile was just one of those missiles, one of those stray missiles that Ukraine launches when it's faced with heavy missile strikes, and which unfortunately land in the wrong place. And in this case, that was in Poland, and in this case, tragically, it killed 2 completely innocent people. In its political terms or geopolitical terms, this missile strike is unimportant. It will be forgotten very quickly. In the initial hours after reports of this missile strike took place, we had the Poles calling in the Russian ambassador and giving the Russian ambassador a protest note. That seems rather premature in light of what we already know. And there was talk that Poland was going to invoke Article 4 of the Washington Treaty and hold consultations with its NATO allies because of this attack on its territory. Well, it turns out that there was no attack on its territory, and the other NATO powers weren't particularly enthusiastic. And anyway, that whole thing has been dialed down. So this is a minor incident, a minor episode. There's only one thing about this which I have to say I did find it intriguing, and that is that even as the hours passed and it had been established that this was an S-300 missile, one of the S-300 family of missiles that had landed in Poland and which had killed these two unfortunate people in Poland, even as that information became widely disseminated, the President of Poland gave a broadcast in which, whilst appearing to concede that this was an accident and accepting that this was not a Russian attack on Poland, he still used that extraordinary phrase, a Russian-built missile. And that was repeated by significant sections, at least of the media here in Britain. I noticed that The Guardian, for example, was running for a time with a story about how Poland had been struck by a Russian-built missile. Now, us grizzled veterans of the MH17 affair will remember how for many years there were references to the Buk missile that shot down MH17 as a Russian-built missile. It was, of course, possibly that, but it could have been built by the Soviet Union. But the point is, this concept of a Russian-built missile is mischievous, because up to now, the great bulk of Ukraine's air defense systems are S-300 missiles and Buk missiles. These are more mobile systems that are mostly used, I think, to defend ground troops. But anyway, defending the main installations, the main backbone of Ukraine's defenses are S-300 missiles. And those S-300 missiles are an inheritance that Ukraine has from the Soviet Union. Now, if you conflate the Soviet Union with Russia, which of course many people do, then you could argue, you could say legitimately, that these S-300s are indeed Russian-built missiles. But of course the point is that they're operated and used by Ukraine. Calling them Russian-built missiles in this context is frankly manipulative. It gives the impression, it's intended to convey the impression that this is somehow a Russian missile, whereas of course, strictly speaking, in fact, it was a Ukrainian one. Now, I don't know why this continued to be done after it was admitted that this was an S-300 launched by Ukraine, which could only have been launched by Ukraine. But anyway, it just another example to my mind of the extent to which some people are determined to find some means of attaching blame or responsibility upon the Russians for pretty much everything that goes wrong. Well, I would say one party went on insisting that it was a Russian strike on Poland, though I'm not sure whether it still does, but it did continue to do so for some time afterwards, and that of course was Ukraine itself. Well, maybe the Ukrainians were mistaken, maybe they didn't realize it was one of their own missiles, but one of their own missiles it was. This incident is now closed, and I'm not going to say anything more about it. Now, let's go back to that big story yesterday. By some accounts, indeed by most accounts, yesterday saw the biggest missile strike that Russia has up to now launched against Ukraine. The Ukrainians claim that around 90 Russian missiles were launched against their country. I've no way of knowing whether or not that was true. They claim, by the way, to have shot down 77 of them, but they also say that around 30 targets were struck, which again, I find the mathematics of this impossible to understand. I'm not going to pay any attention to that. The Russians, for their part, by the way, also make their own claim. They say that all of their missiles hit their targets. And by the way, they add that none of their targets were in the Kiev metropolitan area, and that any damage caused to buildings in Kiev would have been, again, presumably from S-300 missiles, air defense missiles, crashing to earth as they tried and failed to hit these Russian missiles, their targets, these Russian missiles as they came pouring in. And as often happens, the missile strikes, these heavy missile strikes, were then followed by drone strikes, Uranium-2 drones, which also seem to have struck all over Ukraine in significant numbers. I haven't seen any figure yet for the total numbers of these missiles, but I'm assuming that it was, of these drones, but I'm assuming that it was extensive. And the Russians say that it was an attack on Ukraine's military infrastructure and its command posts and such things, but clearly the energy system was again a target. And I would add, and this is, I think, something that's now indisputable, that there were missile strikes. These Russian missile strikes seem to have involved primarily two types of missiles, both subsonic cruise missiles. One was the Kh-101 missiles launched by Russian bombers, principally, as far as I can see, Tupolev 95 bombers operating from within Russian territory. The other would have been Kalibr missiles being launched from the Black Sea, but quite possibly from by the Black Sea Fleet, and quite possibly there were also other missiles launched by land-based Iskander systems, Iskander missiles, which are also capable, of course, of launching cruise missiles, and which no doubt did so. So this was a deluge of missiles, and it took place all across Ukraine. And by the way, and on that topic, shortly before I did this program, I saw flashes of information that there were more such strikes taking place today. I saw a map of Ukraine where the air raid alerts were taking place, and the map seemed to encompass the whole of Ukraine, the whole of every part of Ukraine that isn't directly controlled by the Russians at this point in time. So it looks as if this missile offensive is continuing today. And this is, as I said, by some reports, the biggest Russian missile attack of all. And here again we see the game of cat and mouse that the Russians have been playing with the Ukrainians, because the pattern of this missile offensive, which has been ongoing since the 10th of October, is that the Russians launch enormous, huge missile strikes on Ukraine, targeting principally the energy system. Then, after a few rounds of these strikes, they wait. They let the Ukrainians take steps to try to rebuild and repair the energy system. And as the repairs progress beyond a certain point, the Russians strike again. And this is exactly what they've done. Now, that, it seems to me, has two advantages from a Russian point of view. Firstly, it means that the Russians aren't attacking Ukraine with these vast volumes of missiles every single day, which would be enormously expensive and which might eventually cause them indeed to start running down their stocks of missiles. They can calibrate their attacks carefully. They can do enormous damage, wait and see whilst the Ukrainians are slowly repairing that damage, and then they strike again, and then the Ukrainians try to repair the damage one more time, and then after a certain point, as the repairs have reached a certain level, the Russians are able once more to strike again. And they're able to do that repeatedly, which must be very demoralizing for the Ukrainians, because every time they may be feeling that they're getting close to getting their repairs completed, they find themselves back having to start from the beginning all over again. And the Russians are able to show that they can destroy almost effortlessly any repair work that the Ukrainians do and put the Ukrainians back at square one, where the Ukrainians once more have to work hard to try to repair a system which is in fact becoming steadily degraded, because of course with every one of these missile strikes, these heavy bombards of missiles, Ukraine's energy system becomes increasingly damaged, increasingly creaky. It becomes more of a struggle to keep it running. Even in relatively quiet days, Ukraine now has to face regular power blackouts across the entire country. And of course, with every single further attack, we get closer to that point where the entire system collapses irretrievably, despite the enormous inherent resilience it possesses, having been built by the Soviet Union to power a Ukrainian industrial base which is many times larger than the industrial base that Ukraine has operating today. And of course, there is that other reason why the missile strike is taking place, why the Russians are staggering their missile strike, and that goes back to that comment by John Helmer, which I discussed some weeks ago when these missile strikes first began, which is that it suits the Russians to see what the Ukrainians do as they try to repair their energy system, so that gradually the Russians get a clear picture, not just of the energy system itself, but of Ukraine's capabilities to bring about its repair, so that when the moment finally comes for the Russians to deal their knockout blow, launch their big offensive, they can combine it with a massive missile strike on Ukraine's energy system, which will knock it out once and for all. And I think that was an astute comment by Helmer, based on advice he was being given by an American, by at least by a technical person. And it makes complete sense to me, and it seems to me that it makes complete sense of what the Russians are doing with these missile strikes. Whilst, by the way, I'm on the topic of Helmer, he's on the roll at the moment, and I mentioned MH17 before, and the fact that for a long time the media, a lot of people referred to the book Missile that shot down MH17 as a Russian-built missile, which was a convenient way of not ascribing responsibility to that missile to any particular party, whilst at the same time intimating that it was the Russians who shot down MH17. Well, Helmer has now published a tweet in which he says that he's been in touch with the Dutch court that's been conducting the MH17 trial, and the judge is apparently preparing now to read out his judgment. So we'll see what comes of that. I don't personally have any doubt myself, but anyway, I will cover that when the moment arises. So, a massive missile strike by Russia against Ukraine, one which we have been distracted from discussing by this episode of the stray S-300 that landed in Poland, but one which shows that the Russian missile offensive against Ukraine continues as before, with the same relentless quality, and with Ukraine, and indeed with the Western powers, having nothing that they can do realistically to counter it. I would add, and I'm just going to finish on this discussion about yesterday's missile offensive, which for all I know is still ongoing. As I said, I saw pictures of massive missiles, of air raid warnings all over Ukraine. I'm going to repeat again, by the way, what I said, that I strongly suspect that before very long we're going to see missile strikes on the Dnieper bridges. I read an article, a series of articles on a Russian Telegram channel, which talks about the immense difficulties of attacking the Dnieper bridges, that these are enormously strong bridges built by the Soviet Union, that launching even Kalibr or KH-101 missiles against them is only going to dent them. It's not going to knock them out entirely. Even Ukraine, with all its repeated HIMARS strikes on the Antonovsky Bridge, was never able to actually knock out the Antonovsky Bridge. In Kherson region, as we now know, the Russians actually withdrew part of their forces across it. So it would be very, very difficult to destroy these bridges, these Dnieper bridges, with these subsonic cruise missiles. And as these articles, it was a series of articles, also point out, it would be massively wasteful and very, very dangerous for the Russians to send fleets of aircraft to try to destroy the bridges with air-launched bombs and missiles. You need an enormous number of bombs to do it, an enormous amount of air-launched missiles. There would probably be very heavy losses amongst the aircraft that were tasked with the job, and even then it might not succeed. And I accept all of that. But I think that this underestimates the enormous power of hypersonic missiles. Now, so far it seems that the Russians have only used one over the course of this war, and that was right at the beginning of the conflict, back in March, when the Russians launched a Kinzhal missile against the Ukrainian base of Yaroviv, and supposedly killed hundreds of volunteers, Western volunteers, who were receiving training there. And that was a titanic explosion. And I'm no doubt that if the Russians launched similar strikes on the bridges, we would see enormous explosions. Now, I ought to say, the Russians, as I just discussed in a other video that I did a short time ago, have just issued a contract for supposedly dozens of Zircon anti-ship missiles. These are hypersonic anti-ship missiles. But by the way, they do also have a land attack role. And these missiles are actually even more, well, they're significantly more sophisticated than the Kinjal. The Kinjal is essentially a ballistic missile which is air-launched by a MiG-31 fighter bomber, and it does fly at hypersonic speeds. It's an adaptation, in fact, of the Iskander surface-to-surface missile, and it does have a hypersonic speeds, and it can be incredibly precise. It's a rather awkward missile to carry and launch. The Zircon is much more sophisticated. It uses a air-breathing scramjet engine, and apparently it can operate faster even than the Kinjal. And I've seen references to speeds of Mach 9 and such things, and that it can operate at different altitudes, that it can operate at something like 500 kilometers at low altitude and over 1,000 kilometers at high altitude. So it's an extremely powerful system altogether. Anyway, the TASS news agency provided quite a lot of information about the Zircon, more than we've seen up to now, and it spoke about the enormous kinetic power of this missile, which is many, many orders of magnitude greater than that of, say, a Calibre missile, which is unsurprising given that the Calibre is subsonic and the Zircon is hypersonic. In other words, the impact of a Zircon on any particular building that it strikes is going to be multiple times greater than a Calibre subsonic missile. And I'm sure that also includes, by the way, the KH-101. So if we were to have a volley of these terrifying things, and the Russians are apparently building dozens of them, launched against the Dnieper bridges, well, I think that would be pretty devastating upon those bridges. And also, and I come back to the other thing that I've said, the Russians also possess this enormous cruise missile, the KH-32, which they've also used in various military applications. They've used it in ground attack roles over the course of the fighting in Ukraine. They could use this also, it seems to me, against the Dnieper bridges. And the sheer size and weight of this thing, they're enormous, far bigger than a subsonic Calibre or KH-101. And they are also, by the way, supersonic. And they come in a sort of steep dive. Well, if any of these sorts of missiles were launched against the bridges, again, I can't help but think that the effect would be devastating. So, I don't know for a fact that the Russians have a plan to use any of these missiles against these bridges, but I would have thought the capability to do it is there. And I think that people who think that the Russians cannot destroy these bridges with conventional weapons are simply not being realistic. I think that they most certainly do have that capability. Up to this point, they've chosen not to exercise it. And I suspect the reason that they're chosen not to exercise it is because they're going to do it at the moment when it will be most effective, perhaps in conjunction with the ground offensive that they will, before long, at some point, launch. In the meantime, that brings me back to the topic of what's actually going on the front lines. And the answer again is that the situation appears to be stable. There continue to be constant Ukrainian attempts by Ukraine to launch counterattacks in northern Donbass. This seems to be the main area of focus for Ukraine at the moment. We're hearing lots about a possible Ukrainian offensive towards Melitopol, and the Sea of Azov from Zaporozhye. But at the moment, Ukraine's focus still seems to be northern Donbass, the area where Ukraine gained so much ground back in September over the course of the Kharkiv counteroffensive. And it's clear that Ukraine is making no significant progress there. All their attempts to launch attacks in this area, they hit again against the brick wall, the ever-strengthening brick wall which the Russians, General Surovikin, are busy building. As for the Russians, well, they were reporting some days ago, significant progress in the Donetsk, Ugledar battlefields. We've not had many reports since then, just as we've not actually had many more reports about what the Russians are doing in Bakhmut. I repeat what I've said previously. I think from a Russian point of view, the more stable things are on the battle lines, the better it is, the more time they have to complete the retraining of their reservists, their 300,000 reservists, and their induction into the Russian military in Ukraine. And I don't think that the Russians will want to engage in any big offensives until all of these 300,000 men or so have been fully inducted into their battle force. I ought to say, by the way, that I've been told by reminded by various people that it's not actually 300,000 men that the Russians have called up. It's more like 380,000 men, because there's apparently a large number of volunteers. I stand corrected about that. And I would also add, since we're talking about Russian troop numbers, that Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, has now given some insight into the total numbers of Chechen forces who have fought in the conflict zone. He says that that number is around 20,000, and he says that the Chechen force in the conflict zone currently numbers around 9,000. And I'm going to make a guess. I think that's probably the stable number of the total of Chechen forces at any particular point in time. I'm guessing that there's around 9,000 Chechen troops fighting with the Russian army in Ukraine at any particular point in this war. So, probably some kind of big offensive coming in the winter. More problems for Ukraine with its energy system. I would make a point here, by the way, which is about the duration of this war. Like most people, I assumed when the war began in February that it would be over relatively quickly. Well, most people, when wars start, expect them to last relatively quickly, and it turns out that they don't. I don't know what the Russian timetable is, but I do remember one particular thing, which is that the wars that Russia fought and eventually won in the Caucasus, the wars that began with the advance on Grozny back in 1993, those wars took the better part of 20 years. And of course, the Russians suffered significant setbacks over the course of those wars. At one point, in 1996, they had to pull back from Grozny, as I very well remember. Deeply humiliating for them. They often suffered all sorts of defeats. The Battle of Grozny in 1994 went extremely badly for them. But eventually, the Russians prevailed, and they were determined to keep going. They didn't let go. And anybody who thinks that they're not prepared to fight for months or years even in order to achieve whatever objectives they have in Ukraine, well, it seems to me that this is clearly wrong. The Russians have also been involved, obviously, in the fighting in Syria now for several years. As we remember, they actually sent their expeditionary force to Syria in 2015, and that was 7 years ago. So I hope we don't have to continue to see this war drag on for 7 years, but we may. And if we do, well, the Russians have made it fairly clear that they can absorb the attrition. Their losses are relatively light. Ukraine's losses are, by contrast, extremely heavy. I'm going to say straight away that I don't think this war will last for years, because I don't think Ukraine has the ability to absorb the attrition. But Russia manifestly does. Anyway, I just wanted to make those particular points. Now, all of this is going on against a backdrop of tremendous economic tensions. And over the last few weeks, we've started to see a slow tick up in oil prices, and we're going to see, I suspect, a higher tick up in oil prices before long. And we're also seeing rises in, we're going to start to see, I suspect, the bottoming out of the natural gas price fall in Europe. We're going to start to see gas prices in Europe also start to rise. And the last inflation number in the United States was slightly lower than some people had anticipated and others had feared. But again, with oil prices and food prices and all of those sort of prices rising, it still seems to me that the underlying push in inflation terms continues to go upwards. That is certainly the case in Britain. We've just received confirmation that inflation in Britain, annualized inflation, according to official figures, which are probably underestimating the true level, that official inflation numbers in Britain are now 11%, plus over 11%. Moreover, since I'm talking about Britain, we've now had a assessment of the government's fiscal position from the Office for Budget Responsibility. This is one of these strange quangos that the British government sets up, but it's intended to look at the overall state of the government finances. Anyway, it says that because of the higher payments that the British government is having to make in the form of interest payments, because interest rates in Britain have been rising, the hole in the British government's budget is not £50 billion, as some had expected. It is £70 billion. It is much higher. That is an enormous budgetary hole. And the new government of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, Rishi Sunak being the British Prime Minister, Jeremy Hunt being the Chancellor, of course have come in committed after the dramas of the Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng period. They've come in committed to trying to sort out, as they say, the government's finances. So they have to try to plug this hole. And the government is now talking about tax increases for everybody and cuts in public spending for everybody. Now, very difficult to see how that's going to happen without Britain falling deeper into recession. The British economy is already contracting. It seems to me that the contractions are going to get worse if we start to see problems in the labour market, which we haven't up to this point. But if we do, then of course the social welfare bill is going to spiral. It'll be politically extremely difficult for the government to cut that. But who knows, it might have to. And anyway, one way or the other, the economic situation in Britain is looking bleak. It's looking pretty bleak across Europe as well. Now, I'll be straightforward. I have not been following the economic problems in Europe with tremendous care. As you probably know, I was traveling last week, and I've also caught an infection over the course of those travels. So I haven't really been following too closely what's been happening in Germany and Italy and all those other places. But I gather that the situation is getting harder in those places as well. And I also understand that the southern economies are starting to feel the edge, the South European economies are starting to feel the edge from the increases in interest rates, which are also causing problems for their budgets. So, what is the situation on the other side of the fence? What's the situation like in Russia? Well, as it happens, about a week ago, Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank chair, the person who is, if you like, Russia's, she's proved an extremely skilled manager of the central bank and its activities this year, it must be said. And I say that as somebody who's made many criticisms of her in the past. But anyway, Nabiullina is also, dare I say it, Russia's, amongst the various Russian officials, she is the pessimist in chief. But anyway, she came and she gave an assessment of the economic situation to the Duma, the Russian parliament. And I have to say that for the first time, she sounded not just upbeat, but fairly confident. The central bank is now reporting that after an uptick in September, when inflation seemed to go slightly up, it returned to going down again in October. That might not be an entirely good thing, because it might suggest depressed demand. And if you read Russian commentators, they're very worried that the single biggest drag on the Russian economy at the moment is depressed demand. But putting that aside, Nabiullina seems much more confident about inflation than I've seen her since the start of this crisis back in February. She seems to feel that things are now coming under control. She predicts inflation rates of 5 to 7% next year, and 4%, back to the 4% target in 2024. And she's also saying that the economy has adjusted to the sanctions very fast, that with every month that passes, complaints from industry about sanctions diminish, that they've managed by and large to find alternatives to the imported goods, and that the overall performance of the banking system, the financial system, is steady, and that lending is increasing, which is a sign both of the ability of the Russian banking system to provide loans and of the willingness of the economy to absorb those loans, to seek those loans. When I say the economy, I mean business, and of course I mean consumers as well. So she seemed to feel overall that things are on the right track. And the latest inflation numbers in Russia, by the way, stand at about 12.6%, which is only very marginally above the official inflation rates in Europe and indeed the United States, which I think would have astonished people back in February when the sanctions were first imposed. At that time, there were expectations that inflation in Russia would be 20+%. I remember those figures, and that the GDP contraction would be 15%, and some people thought it would be higher still. Well, it seems that inflation in Russia is probably headline inflation in Russia, annualized inflation in Russia is probably at roughly the same rate now as in the West, except of course that this is inflation over the course of the whole year. And Russia did witness very high rises in prices at the start of the year, but there have been price falls since, whereas in the West, it's the other way round. The trend in prices, at least in Britain at the moment, is for prices to go on rising. And if oil and gas prices do rise, as I expect, then of course we're going to have higher inflation in the West too. So, whatever's happening on the battlefields, and I've already explained why I think attrition is working to Russia's advantage. This is their strategy. It seems to me that in economic terms, the Russians now look very well suited, very well positioned with waging the attrition war, the economic attrition war. They've absorbed the sanctions blow. They've developed their economic relationships with important partners, China, India, Turkey. Before long, I suspect others too. They've found substitutes for most of the imported goods that they imported from Europe, and they look like they're coming through. In fact, it's definite that they are indeed coming through. And for the moment, the situation in Europe is getting worse, and the situation in Britain, well, here it's getting much worse. I mentioned that I was travelling around the British regions. I did, in fact, travel around the British regions last week, and I was again dismayed at the increasing signs of distress that I saw in many places. Now, the Russians have been able to pull things together economically, partly because they're not diplomatically isolated. And we finally saw this with the communique that the G20 published. And it was a fascinating communique. It was slightly different from what I'd expected. Yesterday I was talking about the end, a comment about the end of the age of war and all that, which the Indians were promoting. Well, the final communique did actually say something about Ukraine. It said that some countries, most members, deplored the war in Ukraine, but that almost by definition meant that some members didn't. So the G20 published a communique on Ukraine which exposed its own divisions. But beyond doing so, I noticed that the communique, whilst talking about the war in Ukraine, didn't actually mention Russia. It was as if this was simply a war that was taking place in Ukraine. Well, this is all semantics. It's hardly important. We all know who the parties to this war actually are. But I can't help but think that Lavrov, who was present at the G20 in Bali, must have come away with a smirk. Sorry to use that expression, but I can't help but think it, that a communique like this could have appeared, which doesn't even mention his country as one of the parties involved in this war. Well, there we go. Russians are not isolated, whatever the West may think. The war continues, and it's they who are essentially determining its course with these missile strikes, with this attrition war that they're fighting, with the preparations for the offensive that they are going to launch. Now, we've discussed in programs both on this channel and on the Duran. We talked about it yesterday in a wonderful live stream on the Duran that we did with Robert Barnes. That the pragmatists in Washington are now perhaps starting to understand the importance of bringing this war to an end, and the way in which the incident of the Ukrainian missile that fell in Poland, the speed with which it was acknowledged that it was in fact a Ukrainian missile, even in the West, that may also suggest that the pragmatists at the moment are in the ascendant. I strongly and sincerely hope so. I think that Ukraine continues to make signals which suggest that hardliners in Ukraine at least are not prepared to even contemplate negotiations. General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, has made statements that Ukraine is going to go on fighting until the Russians have been completely driven off all Ukrainian territory, including presumably Crimea. I think the time has come for officials in the West to start telling the Ukrainians this is simply not on. Your country's been bled to death. Your economy's being devastated. We're seriously worried about a migration flow from your country to ours, and we can't absorb these migration flows anymore without facing unacceptable political consequences. Our own economies are in a tailspin, our weapon systems are being depleted, and large numbers, desperately large numbers of your young men are dying. The time has come for you to sit down and talk, and to be realistic about doing so. Yes, we did mislead you back in March. We told you to fight on. That was perhaps a tragic mistake, the greatest mistake made over the course of this war. But that's in the past now. The moment has come for you to sit down and talk. Well, I hope that message is being conveyed. I'm beginning to think that it might be, at least by some people. We'll see. Anyway, I'm almost up to the hour, and I'm going to stop at this point. Be more from me, obviously, very soon. Remember, you can find us on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. And also, I would remind you that I do live streams exclusively on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And I will be doing one, I expect, this Wednesday as well. And last but not least, remember, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.